resume where we left off in our previous video, and that is sketching out our topology with the strokes tool. Once we're relatively happy with the layout, then we can simply hit the enter key, and 3D Coat will create polygons or geometry wherever we have an intersection of four edges. So as I lay this out, I may provide commentary from time to time, but for the most part I'm going to remain silent, and I'm also going to speed up the playback in order to try to keep this video as brief as possible. Okay, so here we go. I think what happened here is that sometimes if you accidentally click on a node from a line on the other side of your geometry, sometimes it may connect up, and that's what happened on that one particular line there. You can also disconnect a line by control clicking on a particular node or a point on that particular spline, and it will split it in two, as I did just then. And then you can pick up one end, the node on one end, and just connect it up with another open end. And as you can see here, I can start from one end and continue brushing, and it will connect up with another line on the other side. Like that. And it looks like part of the line kind of snapped to the mesh underneath that heel panel there. And later on, what I do in this video is, if I've got overlapping objects like I do with the stripes, the heel panel, and some of the trim, sometimes I find that snapping will give you some difficulty. And I'm talking about the geometry snapping, not only with the strokes tool, but just geometry in general. So when you're working with all the polygons, sometimes 3D Coat will accidentally snap your geometry beneath an overlapping object. So what we do, or what I do later on, is I merge a copy of all of the elements here together as if it's one object. I keep the same, the originals, just like I have here, but basically I create just a separate copy with everything all merged together, so I don't have any of those snapping issues while I'm working on retopology. So it's always a good thing to keep in mind if you have these types of objects. And also want to point out too that a good housekeeping or good way to keep your mesh nice and tidy when you merge a copy like that is to right click on that layer and choose fill voids, because anytime you do a merging operation in Voxels, sometimes you may find that it leaves you with some small little bubbles or voids inside the voxel structure. So you definitely want to try and rectify that, because it can cause some issues not only with snapping but also baking as well. So when you go through that procedure, just keep in mind it's a good idea to fill voids as well. We'll take a look at that later on. Now, inevitably, someone's going to ask, well, why don't you simply model everything inside a standard 3D application like 3ds Max, Maya, Softimage, Cinema 4D, Lightwave, and so on? That's a fair question, but I just find in my own particular preferences, I like the freedom that Voxels gives you as you are constructing the model. So there are very few instances where I feel like I can't do a better job in Voxels straight away. An automobile might be a good example because there's a lot of intricate shapes and forms that probably is a bit better handled in a standard 3D application, at least the body itself, but almost everything else, in my own experience and personal opinion, I like creating in Voxels again because I don't have to piddle with geometry while I'm working and while I'm constructing the object. And so then when I get to the stage where I'm finished in the voxel room, then I can simply just render out. If I'm doing something for a client that's going to be a 2D image or something, I can render straight in 3D Coat without ever having to retopologize. So ultimately, I've gotten that model done a lot quicker than I would in a 3D application. I can also export it straight from Voxels as well. If it's going to be a product shot, if it's not going to be animated, the mesh itself is not going to be animated, I can export a high poly mesh, decimated or whatnot, straight for the voxel room. But let's say I wanted to retopologize. I still have options with Auto-Retopology and using the strokes tool here, which is kind of an intermediate Auto-Retopology tool. And it really is, it's almost a paint by numbers, so it's not the same as building a model from scratch in a 3D application, because once again you already have a constructed model that's completed that you're simply just sketching over, and that's really leagues apart from trying to build something from scratch in a regular 3D application. So I just thought I would throw that in there because I know that was always one of my first issues I had to get over is, when do I use 3D Coat or when do I use a typical modeling tool set? And so yeah, you've got to be a bit careful about accidentally selecting lines or strokes that are on the opposite side of the model, which Andrew would, I know it's been requested before, which Andrew would make a way to lock the opposite side, or basically ignore strokes that are on the back facing side. I think that could really help a lot here. But once it starts getting crowded like this, typically I'll just go ahead and hit the Enter key and just continue working with the strokes tool, or maybe with some of the other polygon modeling tools like the quads tool, points and faces and things like that. I also want to point out here is wherever you have a pole or 5-edge intersection, I find that when you hit the Enter key, 3D Coat might create the geometry, but what happens is at that point where you have those 5 vertices, 3D Coat is going to have some issues. You're going to have overlapping vertices that you're going to need to go back and weld. So just keep that in mind. When you create these with the strokes tool, you can't always avoid it, but when you create these poles, just keep in mind that you want to go back with the Move Vertices tool and move the vertices, kind of just wiggle them until you see a red dot, and it's going to weld them together. I think we're pretty close and ready to go ahead and commit this to geometry. So I'm first going to save this file at this point and then hit the Enter key. So as you can see, it created most of the polygons, but left me with a little bit of cleanup to have to do here. And you'll see what I'm talking about, where I have to kind of clean up the overlapping vertices. Deleted that one stray polygon there. And I just welded that one by dragging it over the top of another vertice, like this one. And when you see the red, 3D Coat is letting you know that as soon as you let it off your mouse, I'm going to weld this. So if you don't want that, then move it away from that vertice, and 3D Coat will leave it alone. Okay, you see it there, it welded it. And at this stage, I'm still thinking about how I'm going to lay this out here in the back. For the most part, I've got everything the way I want it in the front half, but here in the back half, I still have to piece this puzzle together. And here I'm using the Points and Faces tool. You can simply hover over the center of where you want to lay your polygon down if it has 3 or 4 edges, and 3D Coat will show you a little blue preview, and once you see the preview that you like, then you can just right click and it will create the polygon. Okay, so we are now going to move on to the next video where we will continue tweaking and cleaning up the geometry. So stay tuned and thank you for watching.